Welcome to the Inside Source Executive Video Series. My name is Dawn Evans, and I'm so excited today. I have Ambassador Susan C. Schwab. She's a professor of public policy at the University of Maryland and a former U.S. Trade Representative and Presidential Cabinet member. Susan, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Dawn.
So you have an amazing career. I mean, you've been in the political scene, you've been in the private scene. Now you're a professor. Tell me, what's the most challenging job and why? They all sound challenging to me.
Well, I've had a wonderful time in my career, public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector. Probably the most challenging of all of my jobs was the last one as U.S. Trade Representative, because it involved negotiating with dozens of countries, lots of different trade agreements, but it also involved negotiating with the United States Congress over the same trade agreements and various colleagues in the President's cabinet. So lots of negotiating over lots of trade agreements.
So the most challenging, you'd say, was the last one, more so than in private sector then?
Oh yeah. In the private sector, I did M&A work for Motorola. A lot of that involved negotiating in China. That was interesting. I also ran the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service at one point, and that was, in essence, running the export promotion arm of the U.S. government. And that was more of a management position. Had a big field operation with employees around the world. That's a different kind of set of responsibilities, more management, less of the sort of trade policy, trade agreement kind of thing. But I've enjoyed all of my jobs, no complaints. I've been very, very lucky and really privileged to have had the opportunities that I've had.
Yeah, you have an amazing career. But we had the pleasure of hearing you this morning, and I tell you, your talk could have gone on all morning. Everyone was saying, why did you only give her an hour? And I said, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. Everyone would be so enthralled. But we talked a lot about key global issues, some issues facing that our companies here should be aware of. So for the video series, could you share some of the issues and concerns that we should have?
Sure. I think the most important one, obviously, for any sourcing interest is the risk of protectionism. And I think that at the end of the day, that is the single most important one. I've referred to it as the potential for self-inflicted wounds. We complain about the inappropriate value, the artificially low renminbi, or we refer to Brazil's increased protectionism, or the Europeans' sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions. You can look around the world, and there are a lot of governments that are doing some pretty silly things in terms of protectionism, including ours, some of the Buy America provisions that end up being copycatted by other countries that are growing much faster than ours, and then they go follow our example and we're shut out of those markets. But the risk of protectionism, I think, is the one that is the biggest one, because you're looking at the world like a zero-sum exercise, and it isn't. It's a positive-sum exercise, and if you shoot yourself in the foot, then you really can be in trouble.
Interesting. So what would you say is the single most prevalent change in how in the world's nations, specifically the U.S., and how we're handling trade agreements today versus maybe 2 decades ago?
They are harder to negotiate. I think, and when I say harder to negotiate, it's not because of other countries, but it really is because we doubt ourselves, and we need to be leading by example, I think, more often than we have. It took the Obama administration a long time to decide that they wanted to get out there and negotiate trade agreements. The first 3 years, there was really no action in the trade area, and then happily last fall, they finally sent to the Congress for approval 3 free trade agreements that in fact were negotiated during the Bush administration, free trade agreements with Colombia, with Panama, and with South Korea. Congress passed those almost immediately, and now happily the Obama administration is getting much more active again in the trade arena. And I think they have been pleasantly surprised to discover that other countries are willing to step up when the U.S. steps up first, and the U.S. leads by example. So it is a heavy lift to go out there and say, I'm willing to take a risk and negotiate a trade agreement. I'm going to be a tough negotiator. You have to bring Congress along with you, and sometimes you need to, risk some political capital to do it, and that's Republicans and Democrats alike. So I think that's really the big difference. There are groups in our society and our political life that just aren't going to like any trade agreement you bring home, starting with organized labor. Organized labor just doesn't like trade agreements. And if you're willing to face that from the beginning, you need to make the case that if you negotiate a good trade agreement, you should be able to sell that trade agreement and don't run away from it.
So the room that we had today was full of people that are involved in sourcing and outsourcing, particularly where it's an election year. And we've outsourced things our entire life. I mean, I have a gardener. I outsource my gardening. Companies have always been outsourcing, but now outsourcing and offshoring have become synonymous especially in an election year. So how do you see that playing out in 2012?
Well, it's one of those things where I sort of said kiddingly in my talk today, it's an election year, high politics. Let's start with the nomenclature. What do we call it? Outsourcing, offshoring, insourcing, near sourcing, global supply chains. I had the privilege of serving on the Boeing board. When a 777 lands at an airport, it lands with parts from 11,000 different suppliers, small, medium, and large. Some of those are outsourced. Some of those are offshored. Some of those are insourced. It varies. And many foreign companies source from the United States. I think the most important thing to remember is that 95% of the world's consumers are outside of our borders. And therefore, if we take the position that everything that we buy has to be procured within our borders, then we are sacrificing the potential of 95% of the world's consumers. And if we want access to those consumers, then we need to be willing to procure from outside of our borders.
That's a wonderful point, because all of our companies that participate in SIG are global in nature, and they have global supply chains. And they're facing the same issues. They need to procure from the right place at the right price to remain competitive in the United States.
Right.
So something they're always facing, and we're always having these conversations. So as we think about trade and as it's going to evolve, what would be the ideal evolution of trade agreements in the next decade? And then what do you see as realistically happening?
The evolution of trade agreements, as we've seen them, has been from just addressing tariffs at the border, taking 100% tariff and dropping it to 50%, for example, to addressing tariffs and quotas, to addressing a much broader range of issues. So, for example, we've moved from just goods, such as manufactured goods and agricultural commodities, to services, to investment. Trade agreements today, we address e-commerce, intellectual property issues, IP, intellectual property protection. We address issues across, just with a very, very wide range of issues. And that's real life. I mean, real life is multidisciplinary. And so I think we'll continue to see that evolution of issues. But that makes trade agreements very, very complicated. And it matches, quite frankly, the complexity of some of the sourcing that goes on among your members. Because some of them are sourcing parts, some of them are sourcing services. Some of them are sourcing tangibles, some of them are sourcing intangibles. And so trade agreements are doing exactly the same thing.
Interesting. So we're leading a delegation of about 20 to 30 U.S. companies over to Changsha, China, later this year to talk about doing some business in China. But there's a huge trade imbalance today between China and the U.S. So what do you think we should be able to do or think about doing to address the situation?
Well, there are a number of things. U.S.-China trade relations can get pretty tense, and for a variety of reasons. We have a huge trade imbalance with China. That is logical. That's a logical evolution in terms of where China is in its stage of economic growth and where we are in our stage of economic growth. But it's exaggerated by the artificially low value of the renminbi relative to the dollar, and above all, by China's breakneck economic growth rate relative to ours. So the macroeconomic factors are exaggerating it, along with, obviously, our huge deficit and their huge surplus. I mean, they are financing our debt. That is not their fault. Okay, the fact that
No,
that
that's
we
our
are
fault.
running, the fact that we are running huge deficits is not China's fault. So first of all, you know, what can you do about the deficit? We need to look to our own fiscal policy. And they need to look to their fiscal policy, and they know that. They need to be less dependent on exports for their growth, and they need to be doing more to stimulate their domestic demand. We know that we need to be doing more to close our fiscal deficit. Now, when you're talking about trade matters, the Chinese need to be doing more to open their markets. Now, their market is relatively open in terms of its nominal openness. They have fairly low tariffs. But it is getting to be a less and less friendly place to export, and less friendly in terms of foreign direct investment, as they promote their national champions and it's something called indigenous innovation, and they're not doing enough to protect intellectual property. And so I would start with intellectual property, particularly in terms of the interests of your members.
Yes.
Your members, above all, don't want to find themselves in a situation where they have IP issues. They want to protect their good names. They want to protect their brands. So intellectual property being a very, very important area. Related to that is cyber. And cybersecurity and cyber espionage have become very serious concerns in terms of doing business with China. Or even not doing business with China as a source of cyber espionage, and that's been increasingly well documented.
Now, are we doing enough to address it?
We're trying, but it's one of those things where, you know, you can stop 99 attacks and then one comes through and you're in trouble. And as some people who are a lot more savvy about this issue than I am have described it, there are two types of companies that know they've been hacked and companies that don't know they've been hacked. And that's really the difference. So those are two areas where I think it's worth being being aware of it, and also even talking about it and saying, here, you know, we want to do business in China and with China. We want China to succeed. We don't want China to fail.
Right.
I mean, we want China to be an engine of economic growth for the world, just the way the U.S. economy has been an engine of economic growth for the world. The U.S. can't do it by itself. But the Chinese need to understand that with that comes responsibility. And that includes behaving in a way that is more responsible to others. And so I think that's part of it. And I think those are messages that can be delivered in a way that is friendly rather than threatening. And we can have good business partners, and we can disagree without being disagreeable. And that's always been my approach. I have a lot of good Chinese friends, including Chinese colleagues who are in the government with whom I've been in really tough negotiations. And they know that doesn't mean that I disrespect them or disrespect China, but they know I'm a hard ass. I mean, I'm just sorry. You probably don't want to. You may not want to keep that in the tape, but that's just, you know, I'm a trade negotiator. Yes. I represent my government and my country, and I'm not apologetic about that at all. So there we are.
So how about your views on Russia? They're going to be entering WTO.
Russia's going to be entering the WTO, and I hope they will end up being a good member of the WTO. It's been almost 18 years of negotiations for them to come in. It's been tough. I think the transparency that comes with being a WTO member, the accountability, having to face dispute resolution, dispute panels that are made up of your peers is going to come as something of a shock to the Russians. I think it'll be really good for Russia. There's some, in the Congress, the U.S. has to pass something called the repeal of the Jackson-Vanik amendment for the U.S. to benefit from Russia acceding to the WTO. I mean, Russia's going to be a member of the WTO whether we do that or not.
Right.
The sooner the Congress can pass Jackson-Vanik waiver or the Jackson-Vanik repeal, the better. I think that doesn't mean that we're saying that everything that Russia does we approve of. It means that U.S. companies need to have the benefit of Russia's accession to the WTO. I think that there are some things that Russia has been doing that are really problematic, extremely problematic, particularly in the human rights area. But if we want to contribute to a growing middle class in Russia, and the Russian authorities having to be more accountable to their people. What better way than to have more transparency and more accountability? And I think that is the first thing that will come with WTO membership. So I think at the end of the day, it will be a very good thing for us, and ultimately for Russia's middle class, and for democratization in Russia, for this to come through.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you for your time today, and I just have to tell you, I'm so impressed. You're an amazing woman with an amazing background, and I'm so pleased that I had a chance to sit down with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Dawn. I'm really impressed with the organization and just delighted to have been able to join you today.
Well, good. Thank you. And this is Dawn Evans, and we're signing out on Inside Source Executive Video Series, and we'll see you next time.